In the spring of 1983, a quiet erasure took place across the American Midwest. On J.I. Case dealership lots from Wisconsin to Ohio, shipments of new utility tractors arrived from across the Atlantic. For years, these specific machines had stood out against the green, red, and orange of American agriculture. They had been painted orchid white. They had carried a distinctive badge on their flanks. They were built in Yorkshire, England. But in 1983, the white paint was gone. The tractors rolling off the delivery trucks were coated entirely in power red. The casting numbers on the engine blocks were identical. The transmission housings remained exactly the same. The hydraulic systems, which had earned the absolute trust of American dairy farmers, had not been altered by a single millimeter. Yet the name David Brown had been completely stripped from the sheet metal. The tractors had not failed. The engineering had not fallen behind. In fact, these British-built machines were actively keeping an American corporate giant afloat in the critical mid-horsepower market. But the corporate logic of Tenneco, the American conglomerate that now owned the brand, demanded uniformity. The soil did not care what name was on the hood. The dealer network did. A decade earlier, David Brown had represented the pinnacle of independent British gear cutting and hydraulic precision, fighting its way onto American soil through sheer mechanical merit. Now it was being systematically reduced to a ghost in a corporate machine. But the real story of David Brown in America is not just the disappearance of a white tractor. It is the story of independent industrial craftsmanship colliding with the brutal, homogenizing force of the American corporate system. Every week, we tell the stories of the tractors that came to America with the finest engineering in the world, and what the American corporate machine did to them. Subscribe if that history matters to you. The story begins not on the gear-cutting floors of Yorkshire, but in America, in the independent Midwest dealerships of the 1950s. The story of the machines that would eventually vanish into the American corporate system did not begin in a boardroom. It began in the deep industrial heart of West Yorkshire, England. In 1939, as the shadows of a global war gathered over Europe, a brilliant industrialist named David Brown opened a new tractor manufacturing facility at Meltham Mills. David Brown was not a farmer. He was an engineer, an heir to a prestigious family business, and a master of one specific, highly unforgiving mechanical art: the cutting of steel gears. The David Brown Corporation had built its empire on metallurgical precision. They did not simply assemble machines. They mastered the transfer of mechanical force. Their foundries cut gears for heavy ocean liners. They manufactured the bulletproof transmissions that drove British Churchill tanks across battlefields. In 1947, David Brown even purchased the struggling Aston Martin Automobile Company, bringing his obsession with performance to sports cars. The tractors that rolled out of Meltham Mills inherited this exact engineering DNA. When a farmer bought a David Brown, they were buying a transmission built to the tolerances of military and high-performance automotive specifications. But across the Atlantic Ocean, the American agricultural market did not initially care about British sports car heritage. In the years immediately following the Second World War, the American farm landscape was undergoing a brutal, horsepower-driven transformation. Domestic giants like John Deere, International Harvester, and Alice Chalmers were locked in a relentless battle for scale. The American Midwest was defined by massive, unbroken horizons of corn, wheat, and soybeans. To conquer that acreage, American manufacturers built heavy, low-revving row-crop tractors, machines designed to work between planted rows, utilizing adjustable wheel spacing and raw, iron-weighted drawbar pull. Drawbar pull, the sheer pulling force a tractor can deliver to an implement dragging through heavy soil, was the primary currency of American farming. Yet this obsession with massive domestic iron created a critical blind spot. Not every American operation was a 1,000-acre Kansas wheat farm. In the rolling hills of Pennsylvania, across the dense dairy country of Wisconsin, And in the tight, specialized orchards of California, farmers did not need an enormous row crop behemoth. They needed a utility tractor, a versatile, mid-sized machine used for daily chores, front-end loader work, mowing, and light tillage. A utility tractor had to be agile. It had to start reliably in freezing barnyards. It required a highly efficient PTO, or power takeoff, a rotating shaft that transfers engine power from the tractor to an implement such as a hay baler or a manure spreader. American companies offered utility models, but they were often stripped-down versions of larger designs or older architectures that consumed heavy amounts of gasoline. An American dairy farmer or mixed crop operator faced a frustrating gap. They lacked a premium, mid-weight, diesel-powered utility tractor with truly unbreakable gearing and superior fuel economy. This American absence was the exact target Meltham Mills intended to hit. In the 1950s, David Brown tractors began their quiet, determined infiltration of the United States. They did not arrive through a massive corporate buyout. They arrived through the grinding, door-to-door efforts of independent regional distributors. Because they lacked the entrenched, continent-spanning dealership networks of the domestic brands, these independent American importers had to convince farmers based purely on the physical capability of the steel. By 1958, the effort crystallized with the introduction of the David Brown 900 series into the American market. The entry was methodical and heavily localized. Available records indicate that instead of trying to conquer the heavy tillage plains of the Midwest immediately, the brand found its first vital footholds through independent coastal and eastern distributors, slowly pushing into the dairy states. Industry estimates from the period suggest that an imported David Brown 900 diesel retailed for approximately $2,750 in the late 1950s, roughly $29,000 today. At that price, it sat in fierce competition with established American models, meaning it had to prove its worth on its very first day in the field. The American trade press began to pay attention. Implement and Tractor magazine, one of the premier arbiters of American farm machinery taste, alongside various state extension programs, started to note the distinct advantages of the British imports. The reviews highlighted the astonishing fuel economy of the David Brown direct-injection diesel engines and the seamless, silent operation of their gearboxes. While an American tractor's transmission housing, the heavy cast-iron shell that protects the internal gears and serves as the structural backbone of the tractor, was often built for sheer bulk, the David Brown housing enclosed a masterpiece of perfectly meshed, quiet-running steel. By the early 1960s, the brand had established a functioning, albeit fragmented, American bridgehead. The number of active U.S. dealerships began to steadily climb, taking root in communities that valued mechanical longevity over domestic loyalty. The tractor was no longer an experimental foreign oddity. It was a working tool. The gears cut in Yorkshire were now turning American soil, driven by farmers who recognized that the name on the hood represented a mechanical guarantee. But survival in the American market required more than just good gears. It required a technological leap that would force the entire domestic industry to take notice. The American breakthrough arrived in 1965, clad in a color that defied every convention of the domestic implement yard. While American manufacturers painted their iron in aggressive, high-visibility colors, International Harvester Red, John Deere Green, Alice Chalmers Orange, David Brown painted the new 990 Selectomatic in a striking, elegant hue called Orchid White, set over a deep, chocolate-brown chassis. To an American farmer stepping onto the operator platform for the first time, the machine felt fundamentally different from a domestic row crop tractor. It was lower. It was more compact. The steering wheel sat perfectly angled for a long day of chore work. The heavy cast-iron transmission housing beneath the seat did not radiate the usual grinding vibration of mass-produced, loosely meshed gears. Instead, it hummed with the quiet precision of a British sports car. the tractor featured a highly refined synchromesh transmission. Synchromesh transmission, a gearbox design that synchronizes the speed of internal components before they engage, allowing the operator to shift gears smoothly while moving, without clashing the metal teeth. In a market where domestic utility tractors often required the operator to come to a complete, frustrating halt just to change gears, this fluid mobility was a revelation. But the white paint and the quiet gearbox were only the introduction. The true breakthrough, the engineering weapon that forced American buyers to pull out their checkbooks, was written in bold lettering on the side of the hood: Select-O-Matic. Select-O-Matic, an integrated hydraulic control system that allowed a farmer to manage implement depth, weight transfer, and external attachments through a single, highly simplified dial. By the mid-1960s, tractor hydraulics were no longer a luxury on American farms. They were a mandatory requirement for daily survival. Hydraulics, a system that uses pressurized oil to lift heavy implements, steer machinery, or power-attached farm tools. However, the domestic hydraulic systems of the era were often wildly complex and entirely unintuitive. An American operator managing a plow through uneven soil often had to wrestle with 3 or 4 separate levers, constantly adjusting fluid pressure and lift height, while simultaneously trying to steer the tractor in a straight line. David Brown engineers eliminated the levers. They reduced the entire complex hydraulic architecture to one master dial and one control quadrant. A farmer simply pointed the dial to the desired function: depth control, traction control, height control, or external services, and the internal valving handled the rest. The system featured incredibly precise draft control. Draft control, a mechanical feedback system that senses how hard an implement is pulling against the earth and automatically raises or lowers the tool by fractions of an inch to maintain a steady engine load. In the heavy, unpredictable clay of the American Midwest, where a steel plow could hit a hard pan and stall a diesel engine in seconds, the Select-O-Matic system functioned like a mechanical brain. It reacted faster than human hands. It prevented rear-wheel slip. It saved expensive diesel fuel. It kept the tractor moving forward. At the dealership level, this technological elegance was paired with a devastatingly effective price point. In 1965, a David Brown 990 Select-O-Matic, producing roughly 55 horsepower, carried an American retail price of approximately $3,500, roughly $34,000 today. For a mid-sized American family farm, this pricing strategy was highly disruptive. To match the hydraulic sophistication and diesel fuel economy of the imported British machine, a farmer buying a domestic brand would often have to purchase a significantly larger, much more expensive row crop tractor that was simply too clumsy and heavy for daily barnyard chores. The David Brown was not a compromised, downsized machine. It was a purpose-built utility masterclass. The market responded with immediate, measurable enthusiasm. The endorsement came not from corporate marketing campaigns, but from the brutal, unsparing proving grounds of the American agricultural establishment. The Nebraska Tractor Test Laboratory, the official testing authority that turned horsepower claims into published numbers. A tractor that failed the test lost trust. Ran the British machines through their paces on the concrete test track in Lincoln. The test results objectively confirmed the extraordinary fuel efficiency of the direct injection diesel engines, cementing the brand's reputation among operators watching their fuel margins. Farm publications immediately took notice. Successful Farming Magazine and other regional trade journals began to feature the white tractors in their equipment reviews, noting the unmatched smoothness of their transmissions and the revolutionary simplicity of the Select-O-Matic dial. In the field, a diverse and highly demanding coalition of American agricultural professionals adopted the machines. Wisconsin dairy cooperatives recommended them to their members for their reliable cold weather starting and agile chore work capabilities. Independent implement dealers across Ohio and Indiana cleared premium floor space specifically to stock the 990 Selectomatic, realizing it sold itself on a simple test drive. Apple and cherry orchardists in the Yakima Valley of the Pacific Northwest embraced the tractors because their low profile and precise, tight handling were perfectly suited for navigating narrow rows of fruit trees. And local county mechanics in Pennsylvania began to fiercely respect the brand, discovering that the sophisticated hydraulic block was completely self-contained and could be easily removed for bench service. This combination of Yorkshire gear-cutting heritage and hydraulic innovation built an American moat that domestic manufacturing giants struggled to cross. An American competitor could lower their retail price. They could add raw cast iron weight to their chassis. They could build a wider dealer network, but they could not instantly replicate the metallurgical precision of the Meltham Mills transmission, nor could they easily bypass the tightly held patents protecting the Selectomatic valving. David Brown had successfully forced the American utility tractor market to compete on operational quality rather than sheer physical bulk. The White tractors quickly became a symbol of discerning agricultural investment. In the crowded implement sheds of the American Midwest, a David Brown did not look like a foreign invader. It looked like the smartest tool in the yard. The name on the builder's plate was not a country of origin. It was a specification. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, the localized successes of the Selectomatic system had consolidated into a formidable, coast-to-coast American footprint. The bridgehead had become an empire. To walk onto a successful independent farm machinery lot in 1970 was to witness a visual rupture in the traditional American agricultural color palette. Tucked between the hulking rows of domestic red, green, and orange iron stood a crisp, immaculate line of Orchid White sheet metal. At its peak retail presence, the David Brown tractor offered a distinct physical experience. A farmer stepping onto the operator platform of a David Brown 1200 or an 880 Selectomatic did not feel like they were climbing onto a piece of crude industrial equipment. The controls fell naturally to the hands. The instrument panel was logically arranged and easily readable. The white paint caught the harsh summer sun. The chocolate brown chassis hid the working mud. The direct injection diesel engine idled with a steady, unbothered rhythm. Most importantly, the machines were now equipped with highly refined independent PTOs. Independent PTO. A power takeoff shaft that draws its rotation directly from the engine flywheel, allowing a farmer to stop the tractor's forward motion entirely without interrupting the power to a baler or forage harvester. In the rolling hayfields of the American East, where a clogged implement could cost a farmer hours of manual labor, this continuous power delivery was not a luxury. It was an absolute operational necessity. The machines were no longer geographical anomalies. A highly integrated American professional ecosystem had embraced the Yorkshire-built tractors, embedding them deep into the nation's agricultural rhythm. In Marathon County, Wisconsin, dairy cooperatives heavily relied on the agile David Brown 880 for the relentless, twice-daily chore work of moving feed and clearing manure in freezing weather. Across the fertile mixed-crop acreage of Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, independent mechanics actively recommended the brand because the heavy-duty engine blocks and gear-driven timing systems simply refused to fail under continuous load. In the Ohio Valley, implement dealers who could not secure a franchise contract with John Deere or International Harvester discovered that the David Brown lineup gave them a premium, highly competitive machine that could go head-to-head with the domestic giants in the utility class. Further west, the tractors carved out fierce pockets of loyalty in specialty markets. In California's San Joaquin Valley, vineyard and orchard operators prized the low center of gravity and the incredibly tight turning radius of the David Brown 990, allowing them to navigate fragile, high-value crop rows without damaging the harvest. The brand even began to command serious attention at major industry events. At the National Farm Machinery Show in Louisville, Kentucky, American farmers crowded around the David Brown displays, drawn by the undeniable field reports of fuel efficiency and hydraulic mastery. State extension services from New York to Michigan documented the operating costs of various utility tractors, and the British machines consistently ranked among the most economical to run. To feed this escalating American hunger, the manufacturing complex back in Meltham Mills, Yorkshire, was pushed to its absolute industrial limits. The factory operated around the clock. Thousands of skilled British machinists cut gears, cast iron, and assembled hydraulic blocks specifically calibrated for the brutal demands of American soil. By the dawn of the 1970s, the David Brown Corporation was manufacturing roughly 35,000 tractors annually worldwide. A vital, highly lucrative percentage of those machines were being loaded onto cargo ships, crossing the Atlantic, and rolling onto the docks in Baltimore and New Orleans, bound for the American heartland. For the independent American dealers carrying the white tractors, the future seemed infinitely bright. They possessed a mechanically superior product. They had captured the loyalty of the mid-sized American family farm. They operated outside the rigid, crushing corporate quotas of the major domestic manufacturers, but they did not realize that their very success had made them a target. The American agricultural machinery industry was entering a decade of vicious consolidation, and a tractor that could not be beaten in the field was about to be bought in the boardroom. The true American cultural peak for David Brown did not arrive on a sunny, celebratory dealership lot. It arrived during a period of intense national anxiety. In the fall of 1973, the geopolitical shock waves of the OPEC oil embargo slammed directly into the American agricultural economy. Gasoline and diesel prices spiked overnight. Suddenly, the massive, fuel-thirsty engines of domestic row crop tractors transformed from symbols of American abundance into crushing financial liabilities. At the exact same moment, the federal government was pressuring farmers to plant fence row to fence row to feed booming international export markets. American farmers had to do significantly more work, with vastly more expensive fuel, while operating on increasingly tighter margins. Under these unforgiving conditions, the Yorkshire-built machines transcended their status as premium imports. On a freezing pre-dawn morning at a Wisconsin dairy operation, where the milk transport truck would not wait for a stalled engine, the David Brown's direct injection diesel reliability and miserly fuel consumption meant the difference between operating at a steady profit and slowly bleeding the family farm dry. A domestic machine might burn 20 gallons of diesel to complete a day of heavy baling. The David Brown could often accomplish the exact same workload on 12. This undeniable mechanical superiority did not go unnoticed by the titans of American industry. J.Y. Case, one of the oldest and most respected names in American farm equipment, found itself facing a structural crisis. Owned by the massive multinational conglomerate Tenneco, J.I. Case built legendary, high-horsepower heavy tillage machines for the Great Plains. But their mid-sized utility tractor lineup was aging, inefficient, and rapidly bleeding market share to foreign competitors. Instead of spending a decade and tens of millions of dollars attempting to engineer a better hydraulic system and a more efficient transmission from scratch, Tenneco executed a brutal, highly effective corporate maneuver. They simply bought the competition. In 1972, the American conglomerate purchased the entire David Brown tractor division outright. Overnight, the David Brown brand transitioned from a scrappy, independent foreign invader fighting for dealership space into the designated mid-horsepower backbone of a global corporate empire. The fragmented network of independent distributors was instantly replaced by the massive, continent-spanning power of the J.I. Case dealership network. Fueled by Tenneco's immense capital, the Meltham Mills factory unleashed its most advanced engineering upon the American market. They introduced models like the 1210 and the massive 1412, equipped with an engineering marvel called the HydraShift transmission. HydraShift, a semi-automatic power-shift gearbox that allowed an operator to sequentially shift through 4-gear ratios on the move, under full load, without ever touching the clutch pedal. In the rolling wheat fields of the Dakotas, this allowed a farmer to instantly drop a gear when a heavy implement hit a patch of hard clay, maintaining engine RPMs and forward momentum without stalling. By the mid-1970s, the visual integration on the American landscape was complete. Thousands of British-built machines, proudly wearing their Orchid White paint and David Brown decals, were perfectly aligned on J.I. Case dealership lots from New York to California. The factory in Yorkshire was producing roughly 35,000 units annually. The dealers were selling them as fast as the transport ships could unload them. The mechanics were mastering the hydraulic valving. The farmers were placing repeat orders. It appeared to be the ultimate triumph of foreign engineering on American soil. But a multinational conglomerate does not purchase an independent manufacturer out of respect for its metallurgical heritage. It buys a company to capture its market share, absorb its technology, and standardize its production. The white paint was shining brightly under the American sun, but deep inside the corporate architecture of Tenneco, the independent soul of David Brown was no longer a mechanical masterpiece. It was a line item on a ledger, scheduled for systemic erasure. The decline of David Brown in America did not begin with a mechanical failure in a Midwestern cornfield. It began in a corporate boardroom in Racine, Wisconsin. The turning point arrived not through poor engineering, but through the unforgiving, homogenizing logic of American corporate consolidation. When the massive multinational conglomerate Tenneco purchased the British tractor maker in 1972, the initial American press releases promised a powerful synergy. The reality of the American farm equipment market, however, was fundamentally hostile to the preservation of a niche foreign identity within a global corporate portfolio. The first structural force to strike the brand was domestic dealer network dominance. The American farm machinery market was brutally, geographically territorial. For 2 decades, the David Brown name had been championed by a fiercely loyal, localized network of independent distributors and small-town implement dealers. These were the men who had convinced skeptical American farmers to trust a British diesel engine. But when Tenneco integrated David Brown into the massive J.I. Case organization, corporate efficiency dictated an immediate consolidation. If a small, independent David Brown dealer in upstate New York or rural Ohio operated in the same county as an established J.I. Case franchise, the corporate parent frequently terminated the independent contract. Hundreds of specialized mechanics, regional parts suppliers, and dedicated salesmen were unceremoniously cut out of the supply chain. The British tractors were physically moved onto the lots of massive American Case dealerships. These larger dealerships were accustomed to moving 150 horsepower, heavy tillage American iron. Many of their salesmen viewed the mid-sized British imports as secondary, entry-level inventory, rather than premium engineering achievements. The second, far more visible force was corporate consolidation and the drive for visual uniformity. For the first few years under Tenneco's ownership, the Meltham Mills factory was permitted to paint their tractors in the traditional Orchid White. But managing 2 distinct brands, 2 separate paint codes, and 2 different marketing strategies across thousands of American dealerships violated the core tenets of industrial efficiency. In 1976, the visual retreat commenced. The striking white paint, the visual signature that had defined the brand's independence, was officially discontinued. Tenneco mandated that all tractors rolling off the Yorkshire assembly lines be painted entirely in JI Case Power Red, with black chassis components. For a dairy operator in Wisconsin or a row crop farmer in Indiana, the color change was not merely a cosmetic update. In the agricultural machinery business, paint color is territorial. It represents a lineage of engineering. The erasure of Orchid White sent a clear, physical signal across the American market. The Meltham Mills factory was no longer an independent builder exporting a proud Yorkshire tradition. It had been reduced to a subsidiary, feeding a massive, standardized American supply chain. As the 1970s progressed, Tenneco initiated a systematic extraction of David Brown's technological assets. Case engineers closely analyzed the Selectomatic hydraulic systems and the highly durable synchromesh transmissions that had originally forced the American market to respect the British brand. Tenneco then applied the principles of corporate platform sharing. Corporate platform sharing, the industrial practice of utilizing a single foundational chassis, transmission, or engineering architecture across multiple different brands or models to drastically reduce manufacturing and development costs. The American parent company embedded the finest elements of David Brown's technology directly into the broader Case product architecture. By teaching the American giant how to build a vastly superior utility tractor, the Yorkshire engineers were effectively engineering their own obsolescence. By the early 1980s, JI Case prepared to launch their new 90 series utility tractors across the United States. These machines, including models like the 1190, 1290, and 1390, were still engineered in Britain. They still relied heavily on the proven David Brown hydraulic block. They were still manufactured by the skilled gear cutters of Meltham Mills. But when they arrived at the ports in Baltimore and New Orleans, the final cosmetic blow had been struck. The David Brown name was gone. The iconic badges were removed. The distinctive hood decals were stripped. The traditional builder's plates were altered. A machine that had fought an uphill battle for 20 years to earn the absolute trust of the American farmer was now branded simply as a Case. The physical tractors were still mechanically excellent, but their unique heritage had been completely hollowed out by the American corporate machine. Tenneco had successfully extracted the mechanical value and discarded the historical identity. The loss of a name, however, was only a prologue to a much larger catastrophe. The British factory had surrendered its independence for the financial security of a massive American conglomerate. But that security was an illusion. A catastrophic economic storm was gathering over the American Midwest, and when the entire domestic agricultural system fractured, the corporate parent would be forced to make ruthless decisions about which factories would survive the slaughter. The American agricultural economy did not gently slow down in the early 1980s. It violently and catastrophically fractured. The 1980s farm debt crisis, an economic implosion triggered by a lethal combination of collapsing global commodity prices, plummeting Midwestern land values, and federal interest rates that suddenly skyrocketed past 18%, paralyzed the American heartland. Farmers who had aggressively financed heavy equipment during the fence-row-to-fence-row planting boom of the previous decade were suddenly facing immediate foreclosure. Farm machinery purchases did not merely decline, they evaporated almost entirely. Across the United States, from the dairy states of the Great Lakes to the specialty crop valleys of California, thousands of local implement dealers were forced into bankruptcy. For the British-built tractors now operating under the corporate banner, this macroeconomic disaster activated a third destructive force: competition from used equipment. In a functioning, healthy economy, a new utility tractor competes against other new models. In the desperate depths of the 1980s farm crisis, a new tractor competed against the graveyard of the American agricultural collapse. Every weekend across the Midwest, county sheriffs and local banks held public foreclosure auctions. The market was suddenly flooded with thousands of highly capable, slightly used tractors being sold for a fraction of their original retail price. A Wisconsin dairy farmer desperately needing a chore tractor was not going to finance a brand new, case-branded British import at an 18% interest rate. Instead, he simply went to a local farm auction and purchased a 10-year-old Orchid White David Brown 990 for cash. The very metallurgical durability that Meltham Mills had engineered into their machines now actively cannibalized their surviving new sales. Inside the corporate headquarters of Tenneco, panic replaced aggressive expansion. The conglomerate recognized that the North American farm machinery market was completely saturated and bleeding cash. Survival required a massive, unprecedented consolidation of resources. In 1985, Tenneco executed one of the most consequential acquisitions in agricultural history. They purchased the deeply distressed agricultural equipment division of International Harvester, merging it with J.I. Case to form a new global titan, Case IH. This colossal corporate merger was the final fatal blow to the Yorkshire tractor builders. The newly formed Case 1H conglomerate suddenly found itself holding a chaotic, vastly overlapping portfolio of factories, tractor models, and engineering divisions scattered across the globe. They possessed the legendary International Harvester heavy tillage designs. They had the established Case dealership networks. Crucially, they also inherited International Harvester's massive tractor manufacturing facility in Doncaster, England. A brutal internal corporate triage began. Case IH executives did not need two separate British manufacturing plants building mid-horsepower utility tractors for a severely depressed global market. They had to choose one architecture to survive. The Doncaster facility was heavily integrated into the International Harvester global supply chain. The Meltham Mills facility, conversely, represented a proprietary, entirely unique engineering ecosystem that was becoming increasingly expensive to maintain in a standardized corporate portfolio. The David Brown engineering architecture, which had single-handedly kept J.I. Case competitive in the American utility sector for over a decade, was now deemed mathematically redundant. Case IH management looked at the sprawling Yorkshire facility not as a heritage site of metallurgical excellence, but as an intolerable operational liability. The American corporate machine, having successfully extracted the hydraulic concepts and transmission designs it required, simply initiated the process of severing the limb. In America, the retreat was immediate and highly visible. Case IH dealerships, now struggling to integrate International Harvester equipment with legacy Case machinery, quietly pushed the remaining British-built tractors to the back of their lots. Corporate marketing entirely shifted focus to the new Case IH Magnum line of heavy row crop tractors. Parts availability for the older, independent David Brown models began to steadily decline. As the newly merged corporate parent purged aging inventory from their regional distribution warehouses, the specialized knowledge required to service the Selectomatic hydraulic blocks slowly began to age out of American dealer service bays. In 1988, the final decree arrived from the corporate offices in Racine, Wisconsin. The Meltham Mills factory was officially ordered to close. The massive foundries that had cast the bulletproof transmission housings for Churchill tanks, the pristine assembly floors that had birthed the Selectomatic revolution, and the gear-cutting shops that had defined British engineering pride for half a century were permanently shut down. Thousands of highly skilled craftsmen were laid off in a matter of weeks. The transatlantic shipping lines stopped carrying the mid-horsepower machines into Baltimore and New Orleans. The American import pipeline, which had flowed continuously since the late 1950s, was choked off forever. The end in America was not marked by a sudden, spectacular mechanical failure in the field. It was marked by the cold, quiet attrition of a corporate spreadsheet. The factory gates locked, the assembly lines halted, the gear cutters stopped, the supply chain severed. The parts shelves emptied, the dealer lots cleared. The mechanics moved on. The name vanished. The machine died. The David Brown name was entirely extinguished from the American agricultural market by the late 1980s, but the engineering DNA of the Yorkshire factory did not quietly disappear. It was resurrected silently and effectively inside the very corporate machines that had replaced it. Long after the Meltham Mills assembly lines were dismantled, the incredibly robust transmission concepts and heavy-duty rear axle designs originally engineered by David Brown were folded directly into the Case E-H Maxim series of utility and row crop tractors. Throughout the 1990s, an American farmer purchasing a brand new, bright red Case IH tractor to pull a heavy planter across an Illinois cornfield was, unknowingly, relying on the mechanical ghosts of British gear cutters. The foreign name was dead. The iron survived. Today, a fiercely dedicated American preservation community refuses to let that original identity fade. At antique tractor pulls in Ohio, county fairs in Wisconsin, and rural estate auctions across the vast expanse of the Midwest, the surviving British-built machines are highly sought after. This secondary market is not driven by wealthy investors. It is sustained by restoration hobbyists, retired local mechanics, and multi-generational family farmers who still revere the engineering. They hunt down neglected 990 and 1200 series tractors, machine their own replacement parts, share complex service manuals through online forums, and meticulously rebuild the intricate Selectomatic hydraulic blocks. Crucially, these collectors frequently spend thousands of dollars to strip away the corporate power red paint applied during the late Tenneco era. They actively restore the machines to their original Orchid White and chocolate brown, physically reclaiming the brand's independent heritage from the American conglomerate that erased it. The original British tractor still matters in the modern American landscape for a profoundly functional reason. On a small, independent family farm, a well-maintained David Brown 990 Selectomatic can still rake a 20-acre field of hay, run a heavy grain auger, or clear deep winter snow from a dairy yard. It does this without requiring proprietary laptop diagnostics, complex diesel exhaust fluid sensors, or a six-figure equipment loan. It provides a farmer with highly sophisticated hydraulic capability combined with pure, accessible mechanical repairability. A critical balance of power and independence that modern American agricultural manufacturers no longer offer to the entry-level buyer. The physical sites of this transatlantic history, however, have largely been erased. The sprawling Meltham Mills factory complex in West Yorkshire, which once churned out tens of thousands of tractors specifically calibrated for American soil, was systematically dismantled. The heavy foundries and pristine assembly floors were replaced by a quiet, anonymous industrial park. In the United States, the independent Eastern Seaboard distributors and small-town Midwestern implement dealerships that first gambled their livelihoods on the unknown British diesels are mostly gone. Their original brick storefronts and gravel display lots have been absorbed by massive corporate agricultural conglomerates, repurposed into suburban strip malls, or left entirely empty alongside expanding interstate highways. The surprise footnote of the David Brown story in America lies not in the iron, but in the intellectual property. Long after the factory gates were padlocked, the fundamental engineering principles of the Selectomatic hydraulic feedback loop, the mechanical brain that could sense the precise drag of an implement and adjust its depth in fractions of a second, quietly influenced an entire generation of American agricultural engineers. The brand's revolutionary approach to weight transfer and fluid control outlived its physical assembly lines. Its concepts buried deep inside the patents and operating manuals of the very domestic conglomerates that ultimately destroyed the company. The arc of David Brown in the United States reveals a brutal, undeniable truth about American commercial culture. It illustrates exactly how the American agricultural market eagerly absorbs foreign excellence, extracts the necessary technological innovations, and relentlessly discards the original identity. It exposes the tragic gap between what farming communities genuinely value, meticulous engineering, fuel efficiency, and mechanical longevity, and what the modern corporate system actually demands: absolute uniformity, massive dealer networks, and consolidated financial scale. When an agricultural culture built on local repair and mechanical independence is entirely replaced by debt leverage, scale, and corporate platform sharing, an independent builder simply cannot survive the transition. Yet, somewhere in the rolling dairy country of Wisconsin, an Orchid White David Brown 990 is still parked beside a wooden barn. Its paint is heavily chipped, exposing the heavy cast iron beneath, and it is leaking a few drops of hydraulic fluid onto the frozen earth. It is still idling with the quiet rhythm of a British sports car, still bearing the foreign name stamped into its hood, and still waiting for a hand on the throttle and an American field that needs turning. See you in the next video.